I'm excited to be at the summit. A lot of people here, and I'm happy that you came to this talk. Hopefully, this will be a helpful overview of some of the concepts behind Managed Pipeline Templates V2, give you a little bit of history, and I want you to be able to walk away from here knowing how you can get started if you haven't started exploring it, how it could be useful to you and your organization, and also just an idea of where it's heading. So let's dive right into it. So I want to lay a baseline. We're going to go over some concepts first. Some of these are just part of Spinnaker putting its pipeline templates aside, and they may already be familiar, but I still think it's worthwhile to go down this path. So let's talk first about pipeline configurations. You've probably worked with pipeline configurations already. They allow us to define essentially a sequence of stages that's going to determine how our artifact will eventually be deployed to a particular environment. These stages are going to have triggers, parameters, notifications, and all these things are going to be relevant to pipeline templates as well. Now, pipeline configurations are persisted as JSON. You have the opportunity to go ahead and build them in the UI, to go into the stage graph and string them together, or you can actually edit the JSON itself, and you're going to see some of these same concepts as we dive deeper into sort of how does this relate to templates. So I want to talk about an extension of pipeline templates, templated pipelines. Templated pipelines are similar, and that is by design. We want to make it as easy as possible for you to take all the stuff you know about pipelines and manipulating them, and then sort of build on that and add some additional properties there. And some of the properties I'm going to highlight are what you need essentially to reference a template from a pipeline, and the variable values that you're going to provide so that you can hydrate the template and actually get a fully executable pipeline that has some additional functionality that it derived from the template. So here we have some pipeline config, fairly straightforward example here. What I think is worth calling out is that there is a template map, and in that template map, we have a reference to the template that this pipeline is going to be using. So this is a templated pipeline. You'll see we're under this reference key. It says, okay, I want the pipeline, the template with the ID new spell template. So this is assuming that you've already saved the template. And I'm going to go into how you would do that as well. There's some other properties here that allow it to resolve where the templates are actually saved, and that's inside of front 50. And then what's worth calling out as well is that there's a variables map. And in the variables, we see this is only defined one. It's called wait time. It's saying that, okay, this is going to have a wait stage. For this particular instance of a templated pipeline, it's going to wait 4 seconds. So let's keep moving now. Let's talk about templates, because it's going to make more sense when we combine these things. Templates have a similar configuration to pipelines, and they actually have a pipeline, a subset of the template is a pipeline configuration. So let me try to unpack that. You'll have a key inside of the template that has a pipeline config that will have stages defined, artifacts, triggers, notifications. And what you define at the template level inside of this configuration will be inherited by any pipelines that reference that particular template. So if I was creating a template and I determined that, well, you know, every pipeline that comes from this particular template should trigger and trigger in this same fashion, I would go ahead and I would put that at the template level, and I would take advantage of the fact that pipelines can inherit from templates. Templates themselves, they're parameterized configurations where they support essentially spell expressions, where you can say, for that trigger I was talking about, you can create a variable, define that in the template, and say, well, maybe everybody needs to configure this trigger a little bit. Let's go ahead and say this particular property will be a parameter that can be derived from the pipeline when it's created. One more thing to note, template configurations are versioned. So when they're saved in front 50, we're actually saving multiple revisions of them, and you'll have the opportunity to tag them or to pin to a particular template, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So here's an example template. You'll see that there's a schema saying we're using V2. I'm going to dive more into MPT V2, although V1 exists and has found success at companies like Netflix and some other large organizations. We also have here, this is where the variables are being defined. You'll see that there's a particular type for the variable we saw earlier. We're saying it's an integer. we're defining it, and this is where, in our previous example, why that pipeline configuration was providing that value of 4. Because it's essentially providing what is needed so that when this template is hydrated, we can resolve the spell expression in there and have that variable be put to use. The stages are also defined here. We see some stages also defined here inside of the template, and these particular stages are going to then be inherited by the pipeline unless the pipeline actually uses an exclude collection to say, oh, I don't want to inherit this particular item. But by default, things like stages, things like triggers, notifications, they're going to be inherited by whatever pipeline is referencing this template. So how do these things actually come together? Well, that's what I'm calling hydration. At the point of execution, when Spinnaker is going to run your pipeline, it has to essentially figure out what is missing from this templated pipeline. And that's going to happen inside of Orca. What it's going to do is it's going to follow that reference that's saved on the pipeline configuration. It's going to get the template, and it's going to look at what it needs to fill in the template. So the template, like I said earlier, might be defining stages. The template might be defining variables. To resolve those variable bindings, it'll look at the variables that are provided in the pipeline config. It'll use those values to hydrate the template, and when you're done, you get one ready to go full pipeline that is essentially indistinguishable from a pipeline that you had just written by hand and was not templated. Hydration happens whenever you go to manually execute a pipeline. It occurs whenever a trigger would fire and start up a pipeline. It even occurs when you go to configure a pipeline. And the reason for this is that when you're configuring a pipeline, you may not really care if it's templated or not templated. You need to see what are the artifacts that affect it, what are the triggers that are defined in this pipeline. So we're going to go ahead and fully resolve that so you can get a full picture of what that pipeline looks like in the UI. That brings me to the last point. Templated pipelines, there's an indication that it's templated, but once you go into configure it, you can see, okay, this is defined at the pipeline level, this is being inherited from a template, and there's even a modal inside of the configuration route where you can see what does the pipeline config look like in its bare state before it's been gone through the hydration process with the template, and what does this fully rendered, ready to go pipeline look like. So I've talked a little bit about the concepts. Now let's actually talk about why I would want to use this. What's the value here? I think where there's a lot of opportunity for pipeline templates to shine and to be put to use is when you're trying to scale out your best practices across an organization. So I'm imagining a model where you have a platform team, and the platform team knows how to do deployments. They know Spinnaker. They're a little bit more knowledgeable in figuring out what's the best way to get my binary in front of users. Now, they've gone through the trials and tribulations of figuring out what the deployment pipelines are supposed to look like. They have codified that in one way or another, and they want to share that. How are you going to do that? Well, pipeline templates give you an opportunity to get your application teams up and running a little more quickly. The application team could decide that when they create their pipeline, why not reference a template, and you'll get to bring essentially all those lessons that your platform team has learned. You could be able to use them essentially for free. It does take a little bit of configuration, providing your variable values, but this is supposed to give you a jump start and let application teams do what they do best, which is build out applications. Another thing that's offered here is that the platform team has the opportunity to propagate changes. Obviously, we learn things, we evolve how our strategies for how we want to deploy our artifacts, and as we do that at an organizational level, we can modify our templates, and then we can use versioning, we can use tags, and we can decide how are we going to disseminate this throughout the organization. So an application team, for example, might decide that they're going to track the stable tag, and they want to automatically receive any updates to the stable version of a template. Or they might decide that, well, that's a little too risky. What works for us is we want to be able to pin to a particular version of a template, and that's supported as well. So I want to talk about what has existed actually since early 2017, which is Managed Pipeline Templates V1. V1 has a lot of conceptual overlap with some of the stuff I've already talked about and what I'm going to be talking about with V2. And V1, it's really powerful, allows you to compose templates from other templates. It allows you to have multiple levels of inheritance. And it even has a CLI for managing and supporting these templates. Now, all of this tooling, is been deprecated or just it really isn't being maintained anymore. And I'll go into that a little bit more, sort of why this played out like it did. So with V1, like I mentioned before, V1 has been put to great use at multiple organizations, but there are some issues that have cropped up and sort of given some intense debugging sessions to the maintainers of templates. Essentially what they found that there was a lot of server-side complexity that went into making V1 work and supporting things like modules or template inheritance. And a lot of this complexity stems from the fact that Orca was using two different templating engines at the same time. Along the boundary of using Java and also using spell expressions, there was a space where lots of different tricky bugs would pop up. And it slowed the speed of iteration on V1, made it difficult to reason about. And also in supporting Java, a lot of custom code was written so that you can do things like template composition server-side. One of the lessons that came from this is, well, maybe this sort of template composition inheritance shouldn't be living on the server side. Maybe we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And that's where the idea said, well, what if we take this out? What does it look like if we do template composition somewhere else? This was going to be a breaking change, along with some of the other ideas that were being thrown about. And that's where V2 came from. So it's going to be a major change. It was also going to be an opportunity to hopefully introduce some enhancements. Some of those enhancements include thinking about what does the template development cycle look like? How does it feel to actually write these templates? How can we make it easy for people using Spinnaker to actually use this feature and to know what they're doing and to feel like they have some transparency into what's going on? This also gave the opportunity, I've started sort of working around the edges of it, but it's also gave the opportunity for this idea of versions for templates. And we'll keep digging into that as we go deeper into the presentation. So now I'm going to shift. I'm going to talk about implementation. I do have a demo that's recorded. It's a little bit safer than going live. There's just too many moving pieces. So what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be talking through the demo, and it should hopefully spell out some of these tools and some of these concepts a little bit more. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Sonnet. So what Sonnet is it is a library that's built on top of JSONet. Well, what is JSON? You may have already used it, but it's a data templating language. It allows you to work in JSON. It allows you to essentially do some of the things we were doing in V1 on the server side. But now we're going to be able to write our templates, and we're going to be able to do things like composition inheritance using JSONet and the extension on top of it, Sonnet, and do all of this outside of the context of Spinnaker, outside of when you're trying to hydrate a template, and hopefully avoiding this whole class of bugs. So what Sonnet does, it's written so that it supports a broad set of Spinnaker objects. It allows you to generate pipelines, applications, templates. It's meant to sort of add that Spinnaker flavor on top of templating with JSONet. So I'm going to switch now to the video. All right. So to start, what I have here is I've gone ahead and installed a Spinnaker using Spinnaker for GCP. Essentially, like, it allows me to get up and running quickly with my Spinnaker instance on a cluster. And one of the things that's nice, it comes with these two sample pipelines. So the pipelines I have here are derived from just running the sample pipeline execution script. And what I have here is essentially one for deploying to staging, one for deploying to production. What that really means is I'm deploying to a cluster where I have two namespaces, one for staging, one for production. And the interesting pipeline here is a deploy to staging one, which you'll notice is disabled. The reason it's disabled is because I'm going to run through recreating a templated version of that. So I don't want to rely on the non-templated one. I just want it there for reference. So let's look at this configuration and try to understand a little bit about what's really going on. So deploy to staging, like I said, it's going to deploy three different Kubernetes objects. It's going to deploy a namespace. That's a staging namespace. It's going to deploy a service, so we can actually take a look at the Go web service that we're going to be deploying. And it's going to deploy a replica set. Now what we have here is we've defined the expected artifacts. You'll see that as I'm scrolling through here, you'll see that there is reference to the manifest. We're going to have a cloud build job that's going to get kicked off. It's going to take the manifest for all those Kubernetes objects, and it's going to drop them in GCS. And we're also going to have a Docker image. That's actually going to be, that's going to contain our Go binary. That's going to just have a simple web server that's going to just show us hello world. So if we keep going through this. The intention is we're going to turn all of this into a templated pipeline, including this trigger here at the bottom. This trigger will, whenever we make changes to our source code for the Go web server, and the build gets kicked off, if it's successful, this is going to get picked up and we're going to deploy to the staging namespace. So when we're done, we'll see, we're going to try to update this, but this is how it stood before going through any of this. Just hello world against a beautiful green background. And we have, this is the source code for it, straightforward stuff. And then I just wanted to go back to the pipeline here to highlight, give you an idea of, this is the JSON for this particular pipeline. Now this is not a complex pipeline. There's stuff that's missing here. We're not cleaning up our service. There's a whole bunch of other stuff you could be doing here. And yet there's going to be a lot of JSON already. I think one of the challenges, you look at something like this and you try to figure yourself, how am I going to turn that into a template? And we can begin to answer that question by looking at this JSON file. So this is using Spinnaker. What we're doing here is we're going to recreate that pipeline, but first we're going to define a template so it's easier for other application teams who want to do the same sort of thing to go ahead and just provide some variables, and then they're up and running. So I'm going to start by calling out here, looking at line 3. So on line 3, we're using the import functionality that's part of JSON, and we're pulling in other files. So you can now actually begin to compose from different files and bring imports and use some of JSON's templating functionality to start making logical, clean separations of the parts that will go into your template. So you'll see, for example, here on line 4, we have MPT, which that's a part of Spinnaker. That's sort of that layering I was talking about, that's Spinnaker specific. And we're saying, okay, we're going to have a managed pipeline template. We're going to add some variables to that. And now we're going to go ahead and build out these variables. So in this first example, this represents the Kubernetes cluster account. Your app team might have their own cluster. Here's what you're doing. You're defining the variables that are going to go into this template and going to be available for the pipeline configuration to reference and provide values for. So we come back to the JSON file that I have here. We've pulled in those variables. We are now actually going to start referencing the artifacts that we saw, the artifacts for the manifest, for the Docker image. You'll see, for example, on line 13, we're now taking advantage of the fact that templates support spell expressions to reference one of those variables we defined. So you'll see on line 13, there's a template variable there. That's when you go through the period of hydration that I mentioned, that's when that value is going to be filled in with what's coming from the pipeline. So I'll scroll through here. This is a lot of defining additional artifacts. On line 54, we start defining our stages. Again, this is stuff that's a part of Spinnaker, which is why you can work with Spinnaker-specific concepts. Line 79, we're defining the trigger that allows us to actually kick off the deploy to staging pipeline once cloud build has succeeded. And then finally, at the end of this, on line 100, we're done. We're going to have a pipeline template. But before we can actually do anything with this, we need to have an idea did I build the right thing? What does this look like? It's still not really clear to me. So this is where we're going to go back to the tape. And let's see. Yeah, this is it. All right. OK, so this is just the same file that I was going through. And OK, wanted to catch it. Great. That's probably really hard to read. Oh, can I make that bigger? No. Well, it's simple enough. I was reading out loud. Essentially, we're using JSON here. We're calling the JSON command. We're passing in a reference to that file that I just wrote, the deploy staging JSON. And then as we go through here, it's going to spit out the generated template. So you'll see as I'm scrolling through this, there's those template variables again. This is now actually closer to what we can actually save and persist in Spinnaker, can go into front 50. This is the template for the pipeline that I showed at the beginning of this demo. Now, what I'm just going to go through here is I'm going to check these JSON files into a repository as we start building closer to sort of an as-code way of managing and deriving our templates. I'm just going to go ahead and push this up. And what I have underlying this is a cloud source repository. So you see it doesn't exist yet. Go ahead and refresh that. And now what we have here is those JSON files that I was working on and I did a dry run on. I said they look good. I pushed them up, and now they're sitting inside of cloud source. And essentially, you can put these things back together, you can compose it again, and you'll end up with that template. But for now, we're saving the JSON files. So what we want to do from here is we want to figure out, okay, well, I have this in source control. I have transparency into what my template's actually going to be built from, but how do I actually get that to Spinnaker now? And this is where Spin CLI comes into the picture. Spin CLI doesn't have to necessarily be used for automation or this particular use case. It's really flexible. This is a command line tool that supports doing multiple things across Spinnaker, whether you're working with canaries, pipelines, listing applications. What it's doing, essentially, it's calling the Gate API, and the same functionality you see in Gates API, Spin CLI, if it doesn't have it, you can work to extend it, and it's fairly straightforward. So the reason Spin CLI is a part of this presentation now is because it also has functionality for managing V2 pipeline templates. What it will allow us to do in the continuation of this demo is that we can use it as part of our CI process. So I went through and I set up a cloud build job that when I go ahead and I push something to that particular cloud source repository, when I push these JSON files, it's going to go ahead and trigger a cloud build, and then that cloud build job will use JSON it. It'll do that same sort of dry run we did. It's going to get that full template file, and then it's going to use Spin CLI to actually go ahead and then push that to front 50. So let's find the section that does that. All right. So what I'm just going through here is this is cloud build. We're just going through. I've set up a trigger. It's monitoring the templates folder. So the way the repository is laid out is there is a templates folder. Inside of that, I'm saving my templates. I want to trigger whenever I push a change to that. That's going to pick up when I'm saving things, when I'm deleting files. In this case, we're just going to demo you're saving a new template. And this was right after I pushed that up, it had triggered this build. So you'll see that this build was pushed from, essentially when I pushed the template folder to master, it kicked this thing off. And I think what's interesting here is that towards the end of it, you'll see that right there, this message, pipeline template save succeeded. What's going on there is it's using this function in Spin CLI, Spin pipeline template save. And what it's doing is it's providing the file that we generated using JSON it, and it's just making a save of that template. And now that template has been saved. There are multiple versions of it. It's in front 50. And it's ready to use, and this is where we can now start looking at the UI. So we'll see that there's a dedicated route now, pipeline templates, and this is what we just were looking at in the command line, and it's been pushed up thanks to the fact that we put it into source control, we triggered, and then we pushed it using Spin CLI. So I just brought up the UI. Let's talk a little bit more about what's going on there. There is now a dedicated route for when you save the template, if you want to view them, if you want to manage them. From that route, you have the ability to then create a pipeline that's going to reference that template, and it's going to inherit things from it, it's going to provide the variables. And you can also go ahead and another UI functionality, convert an existing pipeline to a template, sort of go the other way, and I'll go into that as well. So I have one more video here that's going to just show us the UI in action. So we're picking up where we left off, and what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create a pipeline. So we're going to this is the application that we're looking for. Here's the pipeline name. And what I did for the purpose of the demo is pretend I clicked the continue button because I had it in another tab ready to go, just so that you didn't have to watch me fill out all these fields. So what's going on here is these are the template variables that were defined in the template. This is the opportunity, if you're an application team, for me to say, well, I like those stages, I like the triggers, I like everything you have, but I need it to customize it a little bit more. Here's where you do it. Here's where you say, this is where my cluster's at. This is my GCS account. Here's where you can find my manifests. And you would go through and this is right after save. This is when you would configure this information. What's popping up in the tooltip there is a description that was saved in the template. And then you have an opportunity here to turn off inheritance. So you can say, maybe I don't want to notify, or actually I don't want to trigger whenever there's a CI job that succeeds. And you can go ahead and toggle that off and sort of turn off inheriting that functionality. So for the purposes of the demo, I left it on. We'll see some of the same stages are there. Again, this is not saved on the pipeline config. If you were to look at it, you wouldn't see these stages. This is just coming down from the template, and you can see that the same artifacts are there. You can see that the trigger is there. All this stuff is coming down from the template. But this is a pipeline that's actually just hydrating along with the template and then surfacing this inside of the UI. So we're going to go ahead and save that. And then we see here in the UI that we have now, there's the pipeline that was saved. You got a little icon to indicate that it's templated, and it's going to take the place of that disabled pipeline. Finally, I had started mentioning that you could export from a pipeline to a template, essentially go in the other direction. This is how you would do it. If you wanted to get a head start on writing your template, if you had a pipeline that you had put together in the UI and it works fairly well, here's your chance to get that JSON, and then you can continue tooling it. You can add variables, or you could just save it directly into from 50 as a template. So to pull this all together, we went through sort of how Spinnaker can help you when you're writing templates. We talked a little bit about how if you want to take an as code approach to managing your templates, what you can do is you can then check those JSON files into source control, and then you can set up your CI job to trigger from there. The CI job could actually go ahead and build the templates just using the same tooling, using JSON, and then it can use SpinCLI to go ahead and save it and do other things if you wanted to. Like I said, SpinCLI is fairly flexible. Once the template's been saved, that's your opportunity in the UI to go ahead and create a pipeline, which is what we did, and then we went ahead and configured it. Now, there are multiple approaches for how you want to do this. Essentially, if you have another way that you want to go ahead and create your templates, maybe you don't want to use JSON, and maybe you want to use another templating strategy, data string templating strategy, you can go ahead and do that and use something like SpinCLI to just save it when you've gone ahead and generated your template config. Even sort of how you decide what's going to work best in terms of for your organization in terms of managing templates, there's still, I think, a lot of room here, a lot of opportunity here for opinions to come in from the community, for people to get involved, ping me. Let's talk about it, because I want to sort of explore this further and figure out what's working best for large organizations and also people who are just getting started with Spinnaker. These are the pipelines made famous from that video. What we'll see here is that this is that same service. There's that green hello world. Here's the pipelines that I was showing. I was testing out a little bit earlier. And now what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and update my actual source here. So here's the simple Go service that is being deployed. I've gone ahead and updated this to say hello Spinnaker Summit, and we're going to go for something. We're going to go for blue on this deploy, and then we're going to. So I should have this queued up. There you go. Yep. So I've already gone ahead, got this file, I've added it. I'm ready to commit it. Just going to go ahead and commit this. Just a demo color change, and then I'm just going to go ahead and push this up. So we're pushing this up to the cloud source repository. That cloud source repository will then trigger a job in Cloud Build, and we should be able to find that. Let's refresh. There you go. So what this job is doing is it is going to go ahead and build. It's going to go ahead and build the Docker image, and then eventually we're going to see this templated pipeline for our staging deploy kick off. Once that succeeds, once it puts the manifest in the bucket, once it puts the image in the registry, we're going to see this get triggered. So I do want to talk a little bit more about versioning. I've been mentioning it. I want to dive a little deeper into it. The way it works, when you save a template, essentially multiple revisions are created. One of them is addressable by the digest. So this is what I was talking about. If you're an application team, and you're like, well, this is too dangerous. What if the template changes from under me? What if this thing breaks? You can actually address one particular version of that template by the SHA, and you can say, I want to pin to this, and no matter how many updates, no matter how many times somebody saves a template again, you're going to have that version. It's sitting there in front 50. Templates also support a set of tags. Right now, this is the full set of tags available, stable, experimental. If you're a platform team, you could say, hey, these are the stable templates. Everybody should be tracking this. In your pipeline configuration, make sure you reference this particular tag, and then you're going to receive any updates to stable. When you save templates, there's also a latest entry that's getting created. And if you just omit a tag, you're actually going to just follow whatever updates are coming in. So if you just decide, I'm not even going to think about tags, I'm not going to pin, you're just going to get updates constantly as they come in. It's a little risky. I would suggest, probably using the tags or pinning to particular versions of safer bet. But part of what we want to do is start surfacing what's going on with versioning in the UI so people can have a better understanding of it, people can manage versions, and also sort of communicating how this is working and iterating on it from there. Let's check in if this, okay, cool. So this pipeline is running. Like I said, it's going to be deploying the namespace, it's deploying a service, and it's deploying the artifact that we updated. When it's done, we should be able to see the update. So I'll let that keep running. I started talking about enhancements. There's a lot of ways that we could keep moving forward on MPTV2 and making it better. If you want to get involved, there's a GitHub project. There are open issues. Please feel free to start looking at that, to ping me, to open up PRs. Spinnaker's documentation tells you how you can start contributing, and there's some pretty good docs there as well. It's really something where I want the community to help shape it and to help drive it forward and to say, like, this works for us, this does not work for us, and here's why, make a case for why we should move in a particular direction or not. Part of the ideas that we feel like could be helpful is a more robust UI, essentially around pipeline configuration. It surfaces when something is templated, it tells you a trigger is coming from a template, but it's still the early days of this. Some of the ideas that are in consideration, well, what if there's actually a template UI editor? You could build the template inside of the UI. How can we surface versioning? Should we show the tags? Should we allow people to say, oh, I want to follow this tag and just change it with a few clicks? Another sort of big item to possibly tackle is authorization. As you begin to use templates across multiple teams, it's reasonable to be concerned who can modify templates, who can create pipelines from particular templates. So integrating MPTV2 with Fiat is something that I think would be really valuable for next steps for MPTV2. Let's check back in. Okay, so that was successful in deploying. So like I said, this template could have some additional stages. One thing it doesn't do is it doesn't clean up the previous thing that was deployed, so we're just going to go ahead and do that. And then once this is done, we should be able to check and see the update with the blue color and the updated text. Okay, that should just take a second. Cool. There you go. So that's essentially taking what we started with, a pipeline that was non-templated, somebody had created by hand, was difficult to share throughout the organization, turning into a template, customizing it, and then sort of going from beginning to end and deploying an artifact using that templated pipeline. So to wrap things up, actually I should go back to presenting this full screen. To wrap things up, I did want to make mention of managed delivery. Netflix is doing some amazing work here. There was a presentation earlier. If you didn't catch it, I recommend you watch the recording. Managed delivery, you can think of it as a higher level abstraction than what MPTV2 is trying to do. Managed delivery gives you an opportunity to use additional services like Keel to do things like provision infrastructure, to go ahead and deliver your artifact. MPTV2 is focused solely on deploying your deployment pipelines and deploying your artifacts. It's focused on some of the things I've been going on, essentially using pipeline configurations. These are two things that I think could actually work really well together and in concert. I'm excited about where managed delivery is going, excited about MPTV2, and I think one of the obvious places to overlap is there's an opportunity to sort of build out a shared UI. Some of the stuff that's going to be popping up in managed delivery could be put to use, whether it's related to diffing, versioning, all that stuff can also be of use in MPTV2. And we're working closely with Netflix and sort of seeing the great designs that are coming out of there and figuring out, okay, how can this fit in? All right, so to get started, I would suggest you can convert a pipeline to a template. That's probably the easiest thing. Just go into UI. From there, create a new pipeline like I did earlier in the demo from a dedicated route. Check out Spinnaker.io. The docs are there and they're growing, getting updated. And optionally, you can dive a little bit deeper into it and use Spinnaker or Spin and try to build out a more automated flow. In terms of getting involved, you can get updates at the bi-weekly as code sig. That's Tuesdays at 1. I feel like I'm pitching a television show. There's pipeline templates. That's the Slack channel where questions are popping up, people are having discussions. And of course, you can contribute to any of these 3 projects here. And you'll find plenty of work related to templates and plenty of ideas being thrown around. So thanks. I hope I left time for questions. Let's see. Yep, I did. That wraps it up. I hope that was helpful. Let's open it up to the floor, right?
That was a good presentation. Thank you so much. Yes, questions?
Hey, thanks for the great talk. Just a couple of quick questions. First of all, is there a repo with common templates that you've seen people use that we can just sort of go off of instead of starting from scratch?
So there's not. I think it's a great idea. That was part of why when I started this presentation, the Spinnaker for GCP offering has some of these sample pipelines, and that's kind of what inspired that. I think that's of use. I feel like when you're getting started with Spinnaker, you can benefit a lot from sort of looking at other people's opinions, internalizing it, and then saying, oh, okay, here's how I'm going to improve on it. It's definitely something that I'm open to exploring more, and I would be interested in seeing it on the roadmap.
Because like even the example you mentioned, like you were missing a few things. Like if we could just get some base templates there that have all the best practices,
right?
I think it'll help with onboarding.
Sure. So the example I mentioned, I did omit some stuff intentionally. The deploy to staging is also supposed to trigger deploy to prod. I didn't show that part. There's some additional stages there. But again, like I do think once we've sort of ironed this out fully, it will be useful to then go and tell the community, hey, like, are you trying to do this? Are you trying to deploy to Kubernetes? Here's what you do. Are you trying to deploy to this cloud provider? Well, here's another template. And that's going to sort of accelerate the pace at which we learn what works for large organizations and small organizations and what doesn't. One more thing I forgot to mention. MPTV2 is still behind a feature flag, so you're going to want to turn on a flag to actually see it in the UI. There are some remaining sort of open GitHub issues that are just being ironed out, and then looking to remove that feature flag relatively soon.
Okay, great. That was actually my second question. So it's
Sure.
part of the standard installation with deck and everything. You just need to turn on a flag.
Yeah, so pipeline templates is behind one feature flag, and that actually, there's a bit of history. That's from like if you wanted to use V1. And then the MPTV2 UI, when it was first introduced, there were ways as a user you could essentially like break deck if you clicked on the wrong thing because the UI just hadn't been built yet. So we put it behind a feature flag, felt like it was the safest bet. And I think it's pretty close to where we can just go ahead and take that flag out. There's just a few more things that we want to like test out and make sure are ready.
Appreciate it. So final question.
Yeah.
Do you think this is production ready?
Do I think it's production ready?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like I was saying, the UI is behind a feature flag. I think I don't really see. I guess when you production ready, I think about risk, right? Like if I go and start using this, is this going to break Spinnaker? Is this going to break my installation? I think the risk there is relatively low. I encourage people to start using it, to experiment with it. And I wouldn't say don't migrate everything to a template, leave at 5 o'clock on Friday and then just hope all the deploys work. You definitely want to use the tooling that's there. So I would encourage you use the plan functionality in Spin CLI to see what it would actually look like when it's fully hydrated. Go ahead, make it a gradual migration. But I generally think like it shouldn't be tampering with your installation. It shouldn't be breaking other parts of the application. It's something that's ready for people to experiment with. And I think once it comes from behind a feature flag, it'll be ready for production.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Cool.
More questions?
If no one has more questions, I will ask. So just touching base on more on the managed delivery sort of dynamic. I'm glad you actually mentioned that because I was thinking about that when we started. Where do you see it going? Because it's both of you are trying to accomplish relatively the same goals of bringing best practices in a common place so that everyone can get it instead of having to reinvent the wheel every single time. So are you going to merge with managed delivery, or is the format going to change, and what's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer it from one side of it. I do think here, let's keep talking and pose that question to some of the engineers working on Netflix as well, because I think you'll get a richer answer from it. I just wanted to essentially clear up a misconception. These two things you can use them both. They do not conflict really in any way. And managed delivery, as I understand it, can essentially be accomplishing the goals in that sort of declarative CRD file in different ways. It uses Keel, it orchestrates tasks, but you can do work, you can make it work with templates. If you wanted to, there is a future you could see where you're declaring how, in the sort of managed delivery CRD, how you want to deploy something, and maybe under the hood, it's using templates to actually get that done. So I think there's a lot of room for trying out different things here. The important thing is that they're actually in the same SIG, and so these conversations overlap very often. And if you come to the SIG, it's like half managed delivery, half talking about pipeline templates, and then we often learn from that and figure out, for example, the UI, we figured out, oh, there's some overlap here and we could work on it. So it's early days, we're still figuring out the answer fully, but we're trying to make sure that these are two things that can work together and not run into each other.
Hi.
Hey.
I just had a question about kind of the relationship between Spinnaker and the MPT-v2. At our company, we have lots and lots of different services. Some are in multiple regions, some are in one region. Some of those same applications will have needs for things like manual judgments, some won't, right? So given those kind of multivariate problems, how do you see, so I can see how that could get solved in a straight Spinnaker kind of way, where I can take, manual judgments and these for loop cluster or region requirements, and then generate straight, not templates, but actual configurations. How would you kind of map that to pipeline templates in a way that doesn't become something like manual judgment with one region, or no manual judgment with two regions, or et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, so one of the things I kind of went over, I may have glossed over, but inside of the pipeline config, for example, if you have a manual judgment that only applies to certain particular pipelines, in that case, I would recommend that shouldn't be in the template. In that case, you use the fact that you can override stages or change the stage graph inside of the pipeline configuration to say, well, my particular team needs to add a manual judgment between these two stages and needs to do this here. So you have an opportunity to sort of layer on the additional configuration that you need just specifically in the pipeline, as opposed to raising that to the template level where, yeah, it could possibly collide with other teams in the organization that say, look, I don't need that. So you essentially have to find a happy medium between what goes in the template, what's actually determined to be useful, what's a best practice, and what's something that is going to be more specific to that team.
Thank you.